So my name's Keith Lehwald. I just finished a term as the Acting Executive Director of the Shubenacadie Canal Commission, and I want to welcome you all to the Shubenacadie Canal Waterway. What you see behind me is Lock 3. There are 9 locks on this system, and the numbering starts down in downtown Dartmouth with Lock 1 and ends out in Lance with Lock 9. So this canal system was built starting in 1826. The Shubenacadie Canal Waterway has been used continuously for thousands of years at this point. The Mi'kmaq people, of course, were the first residents, and they arrived about 13,000 years ago. And just about ever since they've been here, they've been using this waterway as a portage route. What you have is the Shubenacadie River running from the Bay of Fundy into Shubenacadie Grand Lake out by what's now the airport. And then you've got a chain of lakes going south from there into Halifax and Dartmouth. That waterway is how the Mi'kmaq went between the Bay of Fundy and Halifax for all of those years. And we know from historical evidence that that route was still regularly used at least as late as the 1750s. Now, eventually, when Europeans came and colonized what's now Nova Scotia, particularly the British, they decided that this little portage route wasn't enough. They wanted to be able to get big boats through here. And that's particularly true because what you had was Halifax being founded in 1749, and you had all the historical communities of Nova Scotia, including Annapolis Royal on the Bay of Fundy. You wanted to be able to get between those two places pretty quickly, but the roads at that time were terrible. And the number one way to get between those two was actually to take a sailing ship from Halifax, go all the way around Yarmouth and back. That's about 400 to 500 kilometers, depending on where you're going. They needed a shortcut, and they decided the best shortcut would be this old portage route. If they could just connect all of those lakes and dig them out and dredge them a little bit to make them deep enough for steamboats, they would be able to use that as a highway across the province. So after a couple attempts to get funding, construction eventually did start in 1826. And that initial construction would have looked a lot different than what we have now. That system would have involved 19 locks running all the way across the province, including 5 in downtown Dartmouth alone. That's just before you hit Lake Minook. And it was a very ambitious project, and it made it a lot of the way to completion. But just like with any construction project you'd run into nowadays, you ran into construction delays, you ran into cost overruns, funding shortages. And this was one of the first major projects in the private sector in Nova Scotia history, so nobody knew quite how to deal with those yet. So by the time 1831 rolled around, this project was several years behind schedule and had already spent about double what the original budget was, and it still wasn't finished. And eventually, by mid-1831, they got to the point where they could no longer pay the workers who were actually digging out the canal. And they were doing most of that by hand, too, so it was pretty grueling work. In 1831, those workers eventually threw down their tools and refused to work anymore. And at one point, they even set fire to one of the locks in protest. That would have been what we now call Lock 1 down in downtown Dartmouth. Imagine protesting workers setting that on fire. That happened in 1831. And that seemed like the end of the story for a long time. But there was one guy in particular who wouldn't give up. And that was a guy named Charles Rufus Fairbanks. He had been one of the original directors of the Shubenacadie Canal Company, and he spent most of the next decade trying to find new funding to finally complete the project. He never did, and he died in 1841. However, he had a son named Charles William Fairbanks, who he had taken on trips around the locks and canal works for much of his childhood. And Charles William Fairbanks ended up getting inspired. He studied in London to become a civil engineer, and in 1847 he returned to Halifax in his mid-20s and said, "I've got a plan for how we can finish this." He said, 19 locks is too many. We can accomplish the same thing with just 9. Another thing, we're using full solid granite for these locks. That works in Britain, but here, with the freeze thaw you get in the winter, it's way too expensive to maintain. So instead, let's just use rubble stone and wood. It'll work just as well, it won't last as long, but it's cheaper and easier to repair. So the other thing that Charles William Fairbanks did is he installed 2 marine railways on the system. Now, a marine railway uses essentially a great big cable car that you can lower directly into the water, float a boat on top of it, and then haul the boat right out of the water and carry it over land. Some are used for dry docks and maintenance, but others, like the marine railways on the canal, are used to get boats from one body of water to another cheaply and efficiently. So one of those that you can see today is the marine railway in downtown Dartmouth on Prince Albert Road, which was just completed in 2018. It's a replica of what used to be there. And that one system replaced what would have been 5 locks in downtown Dartmouth. So with these new, cheaper plans, it still took a few years to get back underway, but by 1854, shovels were in the ground again, and by 1861, the system was finally complete. And that year, in November, a steamship called the Avery, named after the president of the company that was building the canal at that time, made the maiden voyage from Halifax Harbour to the Bay of Fundy without once veering off the canal route. During the 1820s, when the canal was first being built, most of the workers who were doing that were actually brought over from Ireland and Scotland, both as manual laborers and as stonemasons and various other trades. Now, of course, in those days, you couldn't really commute to work in the same way that you could now. So most of these people actually lived in huts directly along the waterway. And in fact, many of them lived with their whole families. So if you walk through Shubie Park in Dartmouth today, you can actually see the remains of these little stone houses that would have been finished with nothing more than mud and bricks and an open wall on one side with a fireplace. Picture living in that year-round, rain or shine, for years at a time, while every day you're spending 8 hours with a pickaxe or a shovel digging up to 10 feet into the ground, sometimes through solid bedrock. That's what those workers did here. There were up to 300 of them at any given time, working from Dartmouth as far out as the Shubenacadie River. And in addition to those houses that are in Shubie Park, we can see some other remnants of those people too. In particular, there's a street in Dartmouth right by the marine railway that exists now called Irish Town Road. That was named for one of those canal towns, Irish Town, which used to exist there in the 1820s. So the Shubenacadie Canal Commission also runs a museum called the Fairbanks Centre, and that's right in Shubie Park at the entrance at 54 Locks Road. And if you come into the Fairbanks Centre, you'll see a bunch of artifacts and stories about the history of the canal. Right, if you walk around the exhibits clockwise, you'll actually get a chronological history of the canal, starting with the Mi'kmaq. So we have a collection of Mi'kmaq artifacts that have been excavated during both construction and remediation work on the canal, including arrowheads and stone tools. We also even have a full-size replica birch bark canoe in there. So of course those canoes are what they would have used to traverse the system prior to the canal being built. We also have multiple exhibits on the construction history of the canal, and also a little bit about Charles Rufus Fairbanks and Charles William Fairbanks and the family connection to the canal. We have an exhibit on what it was like to be a lock keeper and some profiles of the people who actually opened and closed these locks. And it's absolutely incredible what these guys had to do. And I say guys because they were all men historically. The lock keepers actually most of the time rode with a horse and buggy alongside the boats because they were responsible for multiple locks and had to open this one, let the boat through, then ride on down to the next one so that they could let the boat through the next one, and so on and so forth. We end off with a couple of exhibits on the marine railway itself, including a scale model of what you can see in downtown Dartmouth now. We have a bit about the modern history of the canal and the commission itself. And we have a folk art display by one of our volunteers by the name of Alden Killen. And that shows what life would have been like for the canal workers during the 1820s. Behind me is Lock 3. Prior to the construction of the canal in the 1820s, what is now Shubie Park had no particularly large amount of water running through it. It was basically just a forest. So this entire connection that you see today between Lake Micmac and Lake Charles was dug out by hand in the 1820s. That includes what would now be Lock 3. The lock that you see there now, on the other hand, would have actually been constructed around 1858 during the second phase of construction. And if you look at it, you'll actually see those wooden boards and rubble stone all along the walls of the lock. That's a hallmark of the construction style of that second phase. If you want to see what some of the original locks would have looked like, take a look at Lock 1 on Hawthorne Street in downtown Dartmouth. That has solid granite walls, which was more indicative of the 1820s. The wooden doors here are much more modern than that. These had been remediated in the 80s and 90s and even had a little work done just about a week ago. See, the entire point of the Shubenacadie Canal was to bring goods and people across the province quickly. And in the 1830s, when it was first being built, this would have been an excellent proposition. Railways were very uncommon at that time, and canals were used all over the world for that exact purpose. By the 1850s, rail was quickly taking over. By 1853, the Nova Scotia Railway had begun construction, and by 1858, they already had completed lines from Halifax to Truro and Windsor. And you also think about Windsor. Windsor is connected to the Bay of Fundy by the Avon River. So if you were someone wanting to get from Halifax to the Bay of Fundy, when the canal opened in 1861, you had a choice. Grab a canal boat that might take you about 15 hours and had a very uncertain schedule, or get one of the daily trains that got you there in 2.5 hours. It ultimately was no contest for most people. And the canal, despite all of the money and time poured into it, only turned a profit for one of its 10 operating years before going out of business completely in 1871. But, again, it could have been the end of the story, and those ruins could have been left completely alone. But it was recognized that regardless of whether or not it was successful as a business venture, the Shubenacadie Canal was a feat of engineering unlike any other in Atlantic Canada. There are no other canals in our region with more than one lock. And there are very few other waterways that offer this long of virtually uninterrupted recreational paddling, and scarcely with the amount of history that this system has. So, from the 1960s onward, there's been a great effort to preserve, maintain, and even restore the history of the Shubenacadie Canal. This all culminated in 1986 with the founding of the Shubenacadie Canal Commission by the Nova Scotia government at the time. Today, the Shubenacadie Canal Commission and its partners work together with various stakeholders from Dartmouth all the way out to Maitland to figure out how best to preserve and promote that history and that recreational potential of the Shubenacadie Canal waterway. And I'm so excited that Josh and his crew have chosen to come here and highlight some of that for you. I hope you enjoy exploring the canal with us.